It's Friday morning at 10. Oh, just turned 10:01. Um, and it's time for more Apollo stuff. I am continuing my journey of working on this Apollo model. It's a really cool model that has the entire Apollo stack. Apparently, as I'm reading about this, the Apollo is all of this. Okay, which includes a fairing that holds the lunar module, service module, the command module, and the escape tower. And so far, even though it might not seem like it, I have actually accomplished some things. I completed the escape tower and the service module, and I have the fairing painted and it's ready for assembly. Someday when I feel like assembling something, and now I'm working on the lunar module, which is made up of two parts, the ascent module and the descent module. The descent module is the thing with the spidery legs that takes the lunar module down to the surface, and then it stays there. It is a permanent part of the moon while the ascent stage carrying the astronauts takes off. And rejoins the command module, and it gets crowded again. Whoever was up there didn't get to walk on the moon, but enjoyed a little bit of space, at least, some room to spread out a little bit for a couple of days, and then they all come back home. Everything gets jettisoned except for the command module. And so when you look at all of this, it all gets lost in space. Yep, or it burns up in the atmosphere, but mostly lost in space. So the thing I'm working on now is this. And today I can promise this is going to be another one of those days where I'm going to spend a stream, probably like 3.5 hours of actually doing stuff, and it's going to look like I didn't get anything done. And sometimes it's like that. It was like that with the submarine too, that I would, it would take like an entire stream and it would look like nothing happened. Except maybe a little piece somewhere might have a touch of paint on it or something. So this is the instruction manual, and I'm working on these bits here. These look big, but they're not. They're tiny. Especially these are tiny little things, and these reaction control jets are even smaller. I actually got some pieces kind of primed. I primed an antenna and the hatch and that antenna and the astronaut figures that are yet to be finished. So yeah, I'm just going to dive into it. There's going to be just kind of a mishmash of stuff that will be done today. The parts don't fit that well. It's just one of those things. The most I don't know, for me it's going to be challenging part of all of this is getting the windows put in. The windows, the transparent parts don't come as transparent pieces of plastic. They come as a sheet of transparent plastic. And then they give us these little window patterns. And what I need to remember to do is make copies of these, actual copies, so that I don't have to cut up the instruction book because I'm going to need it. Okay. I don't want to cut it up, so I'm going to make copies of this and the windows here for the control module. They helpfully show you cutting a piece of plastic with a giant pair of scissors, which is exactly what you really don't really want to do when you're trying to get these tiny little pieces of plastic cut out of one bigger piece. So, well, I don't know, just kind of dive into it, I guess, is the way it's going to work. And see what needs to be done today. So let me show you that. I'm not going to do this today. I keep not remembering to make copies of these so that I mean, you don't want to use them like this, okay? Because the sheet of plastic is only this big. And so if you cut them out like this, you wouldn't be able to get all the windows out of it. So they all need to be like closer together. Anyway, once I successfully cut them out, that won't be the hardest part. The next part is going to be to get them adhering to the inside of the front of the lunar module without getting them clouded. You know, regular model cement will cloud it. Contact cement is a little too gooey. I've got some stuff called the world's best canopy glue. I haven't used that yet because I haven't glued any canopies on anything. I bought it. I don't even know if it's good anymore. I'll have to test it. I might give that a try. So it's not so much getting these stuck in there. You know, that's not that may, if I get the right kind of cement and it doesn't cloud it, won't be the biggest issue. The biggest issue will be to get them very well masked. You know, this is like an auto body thing where you mask off the windshield so you don't paint it when you repaint the car, right? I need to very thoroughly, very carefully mask them, including these little pointy corners, right? And make sure the masking tape is adhering well, because at some point this entire thing is going to be assembled. These parts will be put on, gaps will be filled in, and it'll be primed and then painted. And it's just going to be manipulated a lot. And also, it'll be put together. So if like a window gets poked out, other than sawing it in half again, which is, I guess, theoretically possible, or cutting a hatch in it somehow, it would be virtually impossible to replace the windows. That would be a problem. So anyway, it's just one of those things that hopefully will work out really well. And if it does, then it will be a yay kind of moment. And if it doesn't, it will be a very sad time. So just to show you, oh no, I'm already knocking things over. Let's show you what I'm talking about. The windows go in the back here. Okay, there's a little flat surface. That's nice that the model designers left a flat surface for the windows to adhere to. But you can see that they are kind of a masking challenge in that there's very sharp corners. Okay, and if this is going to get spray painted later, twice, once with wonder why there's a black spot there. Once with primer, and then once with the final coat, and then maybe even a touch-up with the overcoat, because there's just a lot of weird little nooks and crannies in here that need to be painted. Yeah, well, we'll just see how that goes. So you can see what happens as you put the windows in. That's just fine. And then I will mask them so I can, you know, provide some support from behind. I'm going to wear a glove probably so I don't get fingerprints all over it. And then once this is on, you know, once this is put together, the only access to the inside is through this little hatch. And I suppose, you know, it's theoretically possible to get a tweezers in there and reattach windows, but it would not be an easy thing. Well, this model poses all sorts of difficulties, and I'll be getting into those in a little bit, you know, and then this weird stuff too. Like there's this hole here, okay, and you know, the parts don't line up quite well, but if you get them to line up, what goes in there is this antenna, and this part here, it like broke off because it wasn't really very much totally attached, but you can see that the diameter of this is like way smaller than that hole. So when that's put in, there's going to be an opening, and that's another thing I need to somehow I don't want to attach that before I paint all of this, but I may end up having to, partially fill in that hole either before or after this is attached, which will be after I reattach the little 90-degree angle thing. Yeah, I mean, there's weird stuff like these things, I have to say, why they just attach on the back here and watch. It's like there's a flat surface there and you put these on and you say, given the rest of the process of molding this, why didn't they just mold those on to begin with, included in the mold, instead of having them come in later? I don't know. What it does is it just creates another seam that needs to be sanded down at a minimum and maybe filled in. So part of what I'll be doing today is doing some sanding, mainly a little bit of filing and some sanding to get parts like this to fit, and to get rid of some of the flaws. Like, I don't know if you can see it, but there's the bottom of that window is not flat. There's some flashing, some excess plastic on there that just needs to be rubbed off. And then I need to fix this. This little bit needs to be attached at a 90-degree angle so that it can fill the hole that's too big for it. And we'll see how that goes. Let's see. This is ready to be attached. I might just do that after this is cleaned up. This gets cemented on here like that. And then, after the cement dries, there's seams that show there and here, and I might try to do something about those. But anyway, it's a really cool model, but it's not like precise, and its manufacturing leaves some things to be desired. The worst thing, and this is going to be spending a lot of time today, is this little bit here, right? So it's just a little thing. This is the bracket that holds the reaction control jets. And as it turns out, if you can kind of see it against my finger, one side is bigger than the other. It was just molded larger. And so it needs to be filed down. And I need to try, I'm not sure I'll succeed, but I'm going to try to preserve the little points there that hold the reaction control jets. And then, not only there are different sizes, but there's a divot there, a very noticeable indentation where the plastic didn't fill the hole completely. It's on both of them. I don't know. But these are really going to be a pain because they're almost impossible to hold. There's a lot of plastic that needs to come off. There's parts like these little prongs, the placement pins for the reaction control jets that I want to try to keep if I can, given my skill level. This one is just a matter of sanding down the seams. Okay. This one here is in pretty good shape. The pin on the top and the bottom, these little pins on the top and the bottom for the reaction control jets. On this one, those pins didn't survive. They didn't. There's just a residual one on the bottom and none on the top. So when I cement the reaction control jets to this, it'll be very much freehand. But anyway, these brackets that hold the reaction control jets are really a mess. Yeah, so a lot of what I'm going to be doing today is stuff that'll be almost unnoticeable, which is making pieces like this not only just presentable, which they're not, but actually getting them to be usable, like these or this. That's why it will look like I'll be doing stuff, but it'll be almost invisible. So there, I'm going to move those up. This one's okay. Just kind of move these out of the way. These are parts that are primed. As you can see, not much has really been moving along very fast here. Can't even get it out without tweezers. So it's actually possible, that if there's time and it's feeling kind of right, that I could paint these two antenna. And then these astronaut guys, I need to inspect them. Yeah, I cleaned up the seams on them. There's a seam that goes right along, basically from top to bottom. Okay. They were front and half back. I want to inspect them after they're primed, like now. And if the seams are, I'm just going to, use a fingernail and test to see if the seams have been cleaned up sufficiently to just go ahead and paint them. Like I can see on the shoulder here, just, I don't know. Anyway, so I'll inspect these and maybe do a little sanding. This is the hatch. This is the weirdest part, I have to say. I don't know why this is the case, but it makes it very clear in the instructions that once this is put together, as you can see, just even getting the two halves together isn't that great. Once this is put together, this hatch just goes down like this. Okay. And this is the hatch that goes between the LEM and the command module, is where the astronauts go through. And you have to say, okay, you can't be claustrophobic getting through that, right? You really just can't, assuming these are to scale. But for some reason, the instructions make it clear that it's supposed to set there and not be cemented in place. And I don't know why. It's really odd because it just sort of rattles around. The hole is too big for it. But the weirdest thing is, and I've never seen this on a model before, it's, I don't know, it's white on white, so it's really hard to see. But if I can get the right light on it, it just says, do not cement in place. It makes it really, really clear that for whatever reason, this hatch cannot be firmly attached to the lunar module. And you would wonder why that would be. In the real thing, you definitely want it attached. You don't want your hatchway to go breaking off and floating off into space, taking all the air with it and everything, and not allowing you to be able to dock to your command module. But it makes it pretty clear that you can't do that. And as far as the model goes, I've been trying to figure out why, and I can't. And as parts go, it's just not, I was not able, well, I could have, but I didn't want to sand off enough of this rim to get rid of those little circles. They keep showing up on models. And there's 3 of them on the hatch, and I'm just going to pretend that those are attachment points, like rivet joints or something. Because they're really deep, and that's unusual. If I sanded them completely, there'd be hardly any rim left. It's got rid of about a third of it. So what am I going to do today? I'm going to talk about what I'm going to do today. And at some point, I might start doing it. The things that I would definitely want to get done today, if I can, is I want to cement this piece in place, but I need to clean this up first because there's ridges left all around the round parts from the molding process. So this very delicate antenna needs to be cleaned up, and then I want to cement that back in place and see, just because if it goes badly, I can redo it. I would like to clean these up so that they are usable. These bits aren't too hard. There's just a little bit of plastic there, a little bit of an edge there and there. That doesn't even show, but I'll clean that off so it fits okay, so that they can be cemented in place. Okay, I mean, that's it. So that will be fast, I think, as long as I'm careful. And then I want to try to get rid of the seams on these guys and get these so that the two halves match up. All right. And the process I think I'm going to be using is that things like this and even the brackets, I'm going to debate that. These things fit so poorly. This is there. This goes here. I mean, it's just, there's big gaps all around it. See that? And just really big gaps all over the place. And what I'm thinking is that I would cement these into place, like these parts and these parts and this part, cement them all into place, try to fill the gaps a little bit, as much as I can before priming, okay, so that it doesn't look like they're just pieces of plastic that have been attached to this, but that they're an integral part of the model. The downside of doing that is that if I attach this here, okay, it makes it a little bit harder to attach the reaction control rockets to it later. But for these, it's not too hard. So I think I'll do that for that. These little bits, once they are fixed so that they're usable, go on here, and it doesn't fit right now because there's too much excess plastic on it. They go on here like that, and you can see that it would be nice if it were like an integral part of this. And then let me try this. I want to see how this goes. So if I attach this like this is the back of it. It's just sticking out the back. And if this is attached, yeah, I can get the reaction. I mean, it's not going to be any harder to get the reaction control jets that I'll be showing you in a bit attached to this after it's assembled. And if I can get this to work, it will be, I'll be able to fill in the seams and make it look a little better. Yeah, I think that's the process I'm going to use. So the little reaction control jets will be about like the last thing that's done on this model, which is going to be quite a ways in the future. And I'll be doing some test fitting and that kind of thing. Yeah. So what I'm going to work on is like cleaning up these bits, getting these to be usable and hopefully presentable, cleaning up the bits on here and here. I'm going to paint the insides of the reaction control rockets. I'm probably going to do that sooner than later, actually. And then depending on how things are going, then they probably won't go that well, okay, or at least not that quickly. Depending on how things are going, I will maybe paint these antennae. Just these two. Not that one, because that has to be cleaned up. Well, let's start with painting. What the heck? Let's do some painting. What? Okay, I'm going to rotate this. I'll tell you why in a minute. Get the astronaut guys out of the way. Forgot. I have to deal with these two. I'm going to push a lot of this stuff up and out of the way. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to do the painting of these things over the box. And the reason for that is that they're very tiny, a little bit hard to hold on to. Okay. And I've dropped a couple before and they fell in the box, and that was a good thing because then they just stayed there. And if you got to watch this on Wednesday, you saw me send one flying halfway across the room here. That was not good. Okay, I'm going to start by taking them out of the sticky tack. Putting some one way and some the other, because some I'm taking out with my left hand and some I'm taking out with my right hand. It has no other meaning. Sixteen of these things. Attaching them in several cases, maybe all of them, the little alignment pins are going to be gone. I mean, they are gone on two places. And so attaching these is going to be a little bit fiddly. Just using this to put the sticks in. Let's see. Oh, yeah, there was a question that came through. Somebody was watching on YouTube. Thank you. Thanks for doing that. You can always do that too. If you want to watch me build the submarine, you can go back to the old YouTubes. Some of those were more interesting than this. I was asking, when I attached these, why didn't I use CA glue, especially the kind of gel-like stuff, instead of the real liquidy, the stuff that you can put on and it stays in place? And my short answer was, CA glue is way faster than I am. These are tiny little bits. I'm trying to hold on to them and get them not only in the right place, but the right orientation, because they have to be like at a 90-degree angle to the brackets, right? And my ability to get things into exactly the right place in exactly the right orientation is not so great. And so I didn't want to use CA because it can set up really fast. Maybe not for you, but for me, it's really fast. And I needed to, and it was a good thing I didn't, because in fact, probably like 4 out of the 16 of these, I needed to reposition significantly so that they were in the right orientation. And that took a while to get them that way. And one of them, I had to just take off and start over. And so I used contact cement because for one thing, when you put it on touch the two together, it holds. So if I needed to reposition or change the orientation of these on the brackets, this was on the service module, it minimized the chance of me dropping it as I was trying to manipulate it because it was sticking. It's even possible for at least a while, at least, to take them off and reposition them, which I needed to do more than once. And it's flexible. And the flexibility is not necessarily a real advantage because it maybe, it could droop a little bit. Okay, like it should be like this, but it droops a little bit. And so you need to hold it in place. But I found that it came closer to matching my skill level than CA cement, and that's why. And I just don't use it for anything because of that. I mean, even for like putting these halves together, I don't know if you noticed, but when I was trying to test fit these earlier in the stream, I mean, I had to reposition them like 3 times before I got them together just right. And that's just the way it is for me. And so the model cement gives me enough time to do that, but the CA doesn't always. Okay, especially if you like breathe on it the wrong way and it goes, boink, you are now permanently affixed. Okay, well, that's pretty good. I've been able to spend more than a half an hour not doing anything. I am stirring some paint here. You can see the distortion, right? The vortex spinner thing moves. I'm not sure what it's doing exactly. I think it's like vibrating the camera. But it stirs up the paint. But you can't hear it buzzing. The microphone filters out all the interesting sounds. Okay, take these off so I can see close up the old trifocal thing. Drop of paint here. This is flat black. Oh my. Okay, well, that was interesting. The cap didn't close the nozzle completely, so some paint got out and congealed. So there's a whole kind of weird, a whole pile of paint. There we go. There's a blob of paint there. And the amazing low-tech process here is going to be, I'm going to pick one up, take it off the stick, and take this paintbrush, dip it in the paint. I'm giving you step-by-step narrative, and then get the inside of this painted black. The important thing for me is to rotate it all around, maybe more than once, to make sure I've got all the surfaces covered. So this is my attention to detail. I'm painting the outside of these tiny little jets, very dark metallic color, and then the inside flat black. Probably kind of pointless, but it looked okay on the reaction control jets. So there's one. The little white spot up here, that's the point that's supposed to attach to the model. It's unpainted. last week, my theme was old curmudgeon complains about newfangled gizmos. So that was kind of fun. When you're old and you grow up with certain things and then new things come online, you just say, why? Who needs that? Internet-enabled refrigerators, right? I complained about that. And then I didn't stream on Monday because I was gone. I was away from here anyway. So I wasn't here to stream, but I got to see some episodes of the Jetsons and the Flintstones, and I've talked about those before. And like I said on Wednesday, I'll do a rerun. That's the thing to do in the summer, is reruns. What we call repeated television shows. Yeah, so when we grew up, there was the television season. I think there were two, the spring and the fall, or the whatever. But during the summer, there were no new television programs. I think maybe except for soap operas there might have been, but for primetime TV, it was rerun season. So we got to see the entire season that we just saw over again, and that's all there was. But that isn't what I was going to talk about. What I was talking about is that I saw some episodes of the Jetsons and Flintstones. They really weren't that good. Just the humor was very much humor of its time. Anyway, it was kind of interesting to watch them. And reruns. So this is a rerun because I'm talking about what I talked about on Wednesday. Cheap, isn't it? What could I talk about? I could talk about cars. So what I remember about cars that were made in the 60s and 50s, 60s and 70s, but mainly the 60s and 70s, is that you could fix things on them, which was good because there were things that needed to be fixed fairly frequently. There was, probably don't even know what this is anymore because it's not done. It was called the LOF, lube oil filter. So cars still need to get oil changes and oil filters. Okay, that's still done. But back in the day, the suggestion was that the oil should be changed like every 3,000 miles, which was very often. Okay, that was a frequent oil change, and they really meant it. Okay, let's just say materials were really different then, and so when told change your oil every 3,000 miles, they really meant it because the oil wasn't working anymore. The hydrocarbon bonds started breaking, and it wasn't lubricating, and basically your engine could fall apart. And it would just metal on metal rubbing. It wasn't unusual. It certainly wasn't a good thing, but it wasn't completely unusual. To have little bits of metal in your oil pan. That leads to a whole other series of things that related to cars that we don't do anymore. Anyway, oil changes now, they say every 5,000 miles, but if you read about it, it's every 15,000. So that was one thing about the older cars, is that it wasn't just an attempt to sell more oil, lubricating oil. To say every 3,000 miles, you pretty much needed to do that, because if you didn't, metal would rub on metal, and parts of your car, especially down the crankshaft, was sitting in the pool of oil. That's where the oil sat. Friction would get them. Sometimes they'd break, but they certainly would wear out, and then they'd wobble, and your engine wouldn't work quite as well if it worked at all. So that was one thing, was the frequency of the oil change. But what about this L part? What's the lube in the lube oil filter thing? What's that about? Well, what that had to do was your wheel bearings. Your wheel turns on an axle, and there's a set of bearings, which are like rollers usually, inside a casing, and those rollers roll, when the wheel rolls, they roll on the axle to so you don't have friction, or it minimizes the friction. Well, those rollers sat in a bath of grease, black, pretty viscous grease. It was almost like Jell-O. Okay, I don't know if any other way to describe it, but I'll just say that. And it kind of like the oil. Okay, it wouldn't hold up forever. It lost its consistency as the hydrocarbon bonds would start breaking down, and so there was this grease fitting. It was like a one-way valve, a little one-way valve on each wheel bearing. And then you took a grease gun, which was filled with this black grease, and there was a hose attached to it. And when you pushed the trigger on it, the handle, okay, it pushed the grease out under pressure, and that refilled the bearing cavity, the housing that held the bearing, with fresh grease. And that was another one of those things that you needed to do with some frequency. So it wasn't only there, but there were also bearings on a thing called a universal joint, which was on either end of the drive shaft. Okay, and the U joint allowed flexibility in both axes. And it needed to, because, the car is bouncing around and twisting and contorting in all sorts of different ways. And you didn't want things to break, so they had to be flexible. And you couldn't make it out of flexible material. It had to be rigid. So there were a system of joints, like the U joints, that allowed that kind of movement. Well, those also needed to be lubricated. That was the L in the LF lube oil filter. And if those weren't adequately lubricated, then it would be metal rolling on metal, and it would just start to wear out and create a lot of vibration, and eventually it could break. So that was one thing about the old cars that doesn't happen very much anymore, because they came out with these things. I remember it was a big deal. Sealed bearings. It was, you don't have to lubricate them anymore. In fact, you can't. They were made in such a way that there wasn't any little port for the lube, for the grease gun to push the grease into the bearing. And pretty much what they did was found a way to keep it from leaking. The materials got better and the manufacturing process got more precise. And so, as they would say, for the life of your car, which was like not very long, it's like maybe 5 years tops, and I'll explain more about that. From my memory of cars, I'm not a car person. I'm not giving you a history of cars. I'm giving you my memory of cars. Okay. Yeah. I mean, it was a big deal when they came out with sealed bearings. So you didn't have to do a lube oil filter anymore. You just did an oil filter. That got to the point you didn't have to do it as often. It's not, because the materials just got so much better. So other things you needed to do on cars to keep them running was spark plugs. Okay. I don't think people nowadays even think about the spark plugs in their cars. But spark plugs were good for maybe 10 or 15,000 miles. I'd say, for the most part, it was a good idea to change them, to replace them with new spark plugs like every 10,000 miles. And the part of the reason for that was leaded gas. Leaded gas, gave everybody growing up, between the 1940s and the 1970s had lead poisoning. Let's just admit it, because leaded gas, diethyl lead, that's why they called it ethyl, because of somebody named Ethel, but because of the kind of the lead compound, the lead attached to some hydrocarbons was put in the gasoline to kind of increase its octane, which was its explosion point. But the lead built up on the spark plugs and started closing the gap. Now, if you didn't want to replace them, you didn't have to, okay? I mean, you could recondition your spark plugs, and we did that. There were among the things you needed to do to recondition your spark plugs, the things I remember the most are, one, that you needed to file off the buildup. Okay, basically you needed to clean them so that they were down to metal again. Yeah, and there was a special wrench because the spark plugs were a particular size, and it just made it easier to take them out. You had to detach the wires. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, there were a lot of wires in the car, but you needed to detach the wires to the spark plug so you could take them out. But you also needed to make sure that you put the right wires on the right cylinders later, so they needed to be marked. Okay, they needed to be labeled. If you didn't label them, it was very possible that you would wire the car wrong and it might not run at all, or if it did, it might just try to self-destruct even. But it definitely wouldn't run very well. So there was a lot of stuff. People got really good at doing this. It was a thing, when you started driving, like at 16 and maybe even earlier, if you were helping with your family car, that you would just learn all of this stuff. Putzing around with your car, getting it to run right, changing the spark plugs, or if you didn't have enough money to buy a new set of spark plugs, cleaning them. So after you got them cleaned, you needed to set the gap. So a spark plug has, like any electrical thing that needs a spark, there was a thing that emitted the spark and a thing that received the spark. And so the gap between those two things needed to be set just right. Otherwise, your spark wouldn't work. Okay, and if you didn't have the right spark, it wouldn't set off the gasoline in the engine. It wouldn't explode inside your cylinders. So there were these things. There were gapping tools. They were called. They were like thin sheets of metal, and they were different thicknesses. Okay, because different spark plugs for different cars, right? Not every car used the same kind of spark plugs, and the gap wasn't the same on each one. So there's gapping tools, and it would kind of be like a pocket knife, except that instead of having one blade, there'd be like a dozen of these little thin sheets of metal. And by combining them, you were able to get exactly the right gap. And then, you would manipulate the gap by pushing down on the prong part of the spark plug, the part that stuck out, and bend it over the 90-degree angle part. You could manipulate that so that the gap was just right. So that was part of keeping the car up. Was like I said, I don't know if people even change their spark plugs anymore. I think maybe you're still supposed to, like after 100,000 miles or something. But yeah, spark plugs wore out and didn't work, and you just, if you were at all handy or trying to save money, especially that, you got yourself a spark plug wrench and a gapping tool and a file and a pair of pliers, and cleaned up and gapped your spark plugs and reinstalled them, torqued them down just right so that they were tight enough but not too tight. You had to be a little careful of that. If you got them too tight, you could break them, because there was the metal part, kind of the nut part that gapped onto, but the rest of it was ceramic, so if like your wrench slipped, okay, or if you got it too tight, you could actually like shatter your spark plug, which was not good because that would miss the point of saving money by getting them, fixing them yourself. So you had your lube oil filter, which you wanted to do frequently, like every 2,000 to 3,000 miles. People started doing it, you'd go to the service station. It was always kind of, an expensive thing. So people got to, some people got to doing it themselves. They would climb under their car with like a bucket or a pan or something and loosen you want to make sure that the car has been sitting there for a while, because otherwise it'd be so hot you'd burn your hands, right? So you want to make sure the engine was cooled off, and then you climb under your car, kind of shimmy under the car, and open up the nut, the bolt. Basically, it was a plug, but bolt shaped like a bolt in the oil pan. And then the oil would start pouring out before you could get out of the way, so it got all over your hand. That's why you wanted to make sure the engine was cool, because you're going to get filthy oil all over your hand. And you let that drain out, and then you'd end up with, like, I don't know, most cars were designed to hold like 5 quarts of oil. But when you got around to changing the oil, even if you'd been checking it, that's another thing, checking your oil, right? Like every time you would get gasoline, you would check your oil. I'll come back to that if I remember in a little while, because that was another thing we don't do anymore. But we needed to then. Anyway, people would go under and they'd open that up and it would pour in their hands, and then you'd end up with not 5 quarts because, you know, some of it burned off and the others stuck inside and didn't pour out, but you'd end up with like 3.5 quarts of really black, filthy oil because it was all filled with carbon from the combustion process. And hopefully you wouldn't feel any grit from little pieces of metal. That would be a bad thing if you were, you know, doing that and then you saw like flakes of metal floating in your oil. And you'd go, well, I hope this car holds up for a while. I'm going to count these. And there continues to be 16 of them. So, yeah, so then you needed a special wrench to remove the filter. Sometimes the filter was on top of the engine. You could do it from above. Other times it was also you had to reach down and do it while you were sliding around under your car, which was not a very pleasant thing to do. There wasn't a lot of clearance. It was kind of, you know, you'd on a garage floor or a dirt driveway or something. But you could save a lot of money by changing your oil, and that was important. So you'd get this wrench, which was like basically a band of metal. Yeah, when you turned the handle, it tightened either direction. It was kind of a clever thing. Very simple mechanically, but very clever, I think, designed. And you'd get the filter off, and then more oil would pour on your hands because the filter was full of oil. And maybe you couldn't get it oriented just right. Okay. And then, I don't know, you either handed it out or you just dumped it in the tray with the oil that had been pouring out of the oil pan. I mean, why not? It was just one more thing of oil. Well, while I was talking, I've painted the insides of the 16 nozzles. Yeah. And then once it stopped dripping out of the oil pan into your container that was now full of 3.5 quarts of really filthy oil, you would replace the filter and hopefully get it tight, and then replace the oil pan plug and hopefully get it tight, in that it would seal. And it never really did completely seal after a while. You know, that you couldn't really get a gasket on it that would hold up, because it would get really hot, and it was metal on metal and covered with oil, which was slightly corrosive. And anyway, you got it as tight as you could, and you hope for the best. And then you would put 4 or 5 quarts, depending on your engine, of new oil in. From this can with an oil spout. Those were cool, the oil spouts, where you just punched them into the top of the can and it filled it up, so you didn't need a funnel. And then you hope that there wasn't a leak, you know, that you got your filter and your plug-in tight. And then you just saved like half the price of the oil change because you didn't pay anybody for labor. But then you had 3.5 quarts of really, really filthy oil and a filter that was full of really, really filthy oil and whatever it filtered out, which was even filthier, because that was the point of the filter, right? Is to filter stuff out of the oil that you didn't want in the oil, so it was in the filter. They just threw it in the trash. I mean, the filter, because what are you going to do with it? You're not going to like store them in your garage, or there wasn't any other place to take them. There wasn't, bring your filthy oil filters here kind of place. So they just went in the trash. So, trash from those days included an awful lot of really, really, really nasty oil. Because it wasn't just the oil, but it was the carbon and all of the other chemicals that came from the combustion process that was there, and whatever got trapped in your filter, and a bunch of lead, because the leaded gasoline. Now this seems this is a little bit not good. File this away a little bit. Because the lead in the gasoline got into everything, including the exhaust, of course, which got into your oil and got trapped in the oil in the filter. So, yeah. So what do you do with this oil? That's a lot of oil, 3.5 quarts of really gross stuff. There was some, at one point, as this came later in my memory, there were places that said they would recycle your oil, and they actually did. They re-refined it. At least they claimed to. And you could take your used oil there and give it to them, and they'd put it in a big tank, and then who knows what they do with it, really. I guess sometimes you just, you took it out to the field, and dumped it, because why not? Some people burned it. But yeah, there was just, there was just all this oil from people changing their own oil that needed to go somewhere, and it did. It went somewhere. No, I did a fairly good job of getting the seams on these things cleaned up. It's not going to look too bad once it's painted. These guys sit in the command module, and there's a hatch that opens up. At least in theory, it'll open up, and you can see their heads, and you can look, just kind of look at them. When I put these things together, the parts didn't fit all that well. The fronts and the backs didn't, and there were some really serious seams down the sides of these figures. And it looks like they don't look too bad. I'm not putting my head magnifier on. I don't want to see these things under 2x magnification under bright light. I just want to see them with my eyes as well as my eyes work. Okay, because I mention frequently that the secret to the display of a model constructed at my skill level is to keep the viewer at least 18 inches away, minimum of 18 inches away, and under fairly dim lighting conditions. Then it will look. Then it'll look okay. I'm observing these figures under the same conditions, except I'm closer than 18 inches because I can't see very well at that distance. Yeah. So yeah, you had lube oil filter. You needed to do that with very frequently, at least every 3,000 miles. Otherwise, the oil would break down, and you would start losing parts of your engine, like the piston rings and the bearings in the crankshaft. And that would definitely not be good, because it would result in your engine just basically blowing up. Like a piston rod would break, or your crankshaft would crack or something, and your car would be useless unless you got a new motor. And that was actually a thing. I'll digress a little bit here and just say, believe it or not, that actually was a thing, that replacing motors in a car was not an uncommon thing. If you were lucky enough to have a car that hadn't rusted out in like 3 years or so, or if you just put a lot of miles on a car, so that maybe you hit 60, 70,000 miles in the span of a year or two, you might just find that your motor needed, you just got a new one and they put it in. And it was less expensive than buying a new car, but that was a thing that was done. So that kind of leads to some other things when you're talking about your motor. So, lube oil filter, frequently replacing spark plugs, the belts on the car would wear out quickly compared to now. That's another thing. You don't really think about changing out the belts on your car, the alternator belt or the timing belt or whatever you've got. As cars progressed, they had fewer belts, and they put cars in with like one belt that ran everything: the power steering pump and the water pump and the fan and the timing on the crankshaft and everything. Big serpentine belt, big wide thick one. But again, the materials weren't all that great. And so that after a period of time, not necessarily the number of miles, but the time, the belts would break. And it was common. I mean, it was fairly common to be driving down the road, city, highway, whatever, and just see broken belts in the road. They're like this big, oftentimes, kind of, like that. And that's because they would break, because the rubber would get brittle and it would crack. So every time you had a tune-up, I haven't talked about that yet. When you had a tune-up, you would inspect the belts in your car. And it was, a fairly common thing that like once a year or so, you'd have to replace a belt. And the cars were usually made so that was a fairly straightforward thing to do. I was even able to do it. If you had a wrench and a screwdriver, you could loosen something, like the alternator was like on a pivot, right? So it was bolted in and then another in two spots, but one was a pivot point and the other one was in a slot that rotated. The slot didn't rotate it. You could rotate it in the slot, which allowed you to loosen it up, both nuts, and turn it, rotate it in such a way that the belt became loose. Then you could pull it off the pulleys, reach way down inside the motor. Once again, you want to make sure that it is sufficiently cooled off. Otherwise, you would burn yourself pretty badly bumping into hot parts. Put the belt on, retension it by having somebody push on your alternator or water pump or whatever, to hold the belt tight, but not too tight, just tight enough, but not too tight. There were ways of measuring that, but we didn't have those at home. And then you tighten the nuts on the pivot and the slot so that it it was tight, and then you'd turn on the engine and you'd listen, and you could tell if you got the belt right if it didn't squeal when the engine was on. The squealing meant that it was slipping on the pulleys. Okay, and then you needed to turn off the engine before it got too hot and retension your belt. But yeah, that was another thing you needed to pay attention to. Is the belts in the car, because they would get brittle and they would break. And it was a common problem. Like I said, it would not be unusual to be driving along a street and seeing broken belts kind of laying around. Because when they break, they'd fly off and just fall on the street, get slapped onto the street. That's how that would work. Using, as it's getting down to the surface where it's supposed to be, I'm going to use sandpaper and a sanding block to do the last bits of it here. Trying to avoid file marks, but also, trying to make sure I might have to do this in 2 steps. It's the 600 grit sandpaper first, and then the polishing sandpaper next. You're beginning to see that cars back in the 50s and 60s, just stuff was wearing out and breaking all the time, and it was. The materials were not as good as they are now. So, yeah, spark plugs needed to be removed, cleaned, and gapped and replaced. Oil needed to be changed. Bearings needed to be lubricated. Belts needed to be checked frequently because they would get brittle and break. The other electrical component of the car, we talked about lube oil filter, LOF. There was the thing called points and plugs. That was another routine maintenance thing you would do, points and plugs. And I talked about the spark plugs. That was the plug part of sparks and plugs. The points part were inside your distributor cap. So in my simplistic remembrance of how this all worked, inside the distributor, which it did, the electricity from the battery came into the distributor cap, and what you wanted to do was get it to the cylinder that you wanted to fire, okay? Because you didn't want all 6 or 8 cylinders firing at once. You wanted them to fire in a particular sequence with a particular timing. They would fire one after the other, right? But you wanted them to fire in a particular sequence with a particular timing. So the way this was done, and it was really kind of elegant, was just sort of picture this. Electricity comes in the middle, okay, and then goes out on an arm, like a hand on an analog watch, like the minute hand. It comes from the middle and goes out on that arm, okay? And then instead of having numbers on a clock, you had little dots of metal, okay? And when the arm with the electricity passed over the dot, it would send the electricity into the dot, and then that dot would send the electricity through a wire to the spark plug, which would then fire. Hopefully, it would fire right when the compression phase of the movement of the piston was at its peak or really close to it. That was the timing part. Is the pistons moving up and down. It pushes out the exhaust, comes back in, draws fuel, pushes back up again, compresses the fuel in the air mixture, and it's supposed to explode right at that point. That's when the arm would touch that dot and send electricity to that spark plug. Okay? Which is why timing, which was driven by a belt with a dot on it, and you set the timing with a strobe light so that when the strobe was at the right frequency, the dot would be standing still. It's hard to explain that without seeing it. Anyway, yeah, you would have to, and you can imagine that was metal on metal. It would just be rotating, right? So there's a bearing in the middle, and it's rotating around, and when it's touching, each time it touches, because it had to touch the needle, the hand had to touch the dot of metal to make contact, it would wear out because there's friction. And they were designed so that it minimized that, but it still was. So what you needed to do is you took off the top of the distributor cap, and replaced those points. Set up so that they're fairly easy. The distributor was usually on top of the car, on top of the engine, so you could get to it when you open the hood, and you could just do that. And that was another kind of thing that people started doing, a do-it-yourself kind of thing. But it was highly recommended, and I agree, it was a good idea to replace the points along with the plugs. That was not something you could, like with the plugs, you could. Yeah, there's a sort of a gap there. With the plugs, you could clean them and gap them. But the distributor points, you really couldn't do that. They were just worn out. So you needed to get new ones. And that's the way it was. But that's not all you needed to do to keep your car going. Nope. So usually the points and plugs were either replaced your plugs or you cleaned them up and gapped them. The points got replaced because there wasn't anything else you could do. It was all part of a tune-up. And a tune-up was a thing that you did, and I'm trying to remember, I think it was like every 10,000 miles. It was fairly frequently. You would do it at a minimum of once a year. Okay. You do a tune-up at minimum of once a year. And as part of the tune-up, you do your lube oil filter, rotate your tires, that is, move them from one place to the other so that the wear was even, because otherwise it wasn't. The tires in certain places, because of just the forces from turns and things, would wear out at different rates. So you'd rotate them so that the ones that wore out most quickly were put in a place where they wore out least quickly, and vice versa. We'd check all the belts, not just for wear, but for tensioning, to make sure. Oftentimes you'd come in and go, I hear a squeaking under the hood. Well, that's when your belts is loose, and they'd check to see whether it just needed to be retensioned. That is, the made tire usually, or whether it needed to be replaced. You get a new air filter, in addition to the oil filter, and then points and plugs, and then timing, because after those were replaced, then you wanted to check to make sure that cylinders were firing at the right time. Otherwise, it would be very inefficient and possibly damaging to the engine. Yeah. That was something that needed to be done at least once a year, sometimes every 6 months, depending on how many miles you were driving and what your driving conditions were. So it was a pretty extensive kind of thing to keep these cars running. And then, wiper blades would wear out more quickly because the rubber would crack and get, dry and get crack. Air filters needed to be, when you did a tune-up, you always replaced the air filter. It was always filthy. Then cars usually, not always, but usually cars were made because in a way that all of these things that needed to be replaced with some frequency, like spark plugs, right? Or distributor caps, points, were fairly easily accessible. That is, you could open the hood and reach them. Or if you sometimes get under the car and reach them, because it just needed to be serviced with a frequency we're not used to now. So that was another thing. Although there were some notable exceptions to that, I don't know if this was actually true or not. I mean, we all heard about it, but I think it was one of the Chevy Novas, which was at the time a fairly small car. And they put this gigantic V8 engine in it, so it was massively overpowered. Why not? Why not have a massively overpowered car? That was a thing to do then. Still is, I guess, really. I'm polishing the entire side of this because otherwise the part that was filed and sanded would have a different surface texture. I need to go back to the other one and make sure it's done the same way. But yeah, it's that. Oh yeah, and then I was talking about this, and then I said I would come back to it, and I remembered to come back to this, which has to do with oil. I mean, there's still a recommendation that you check your oil. There's a stick. You might not even know that. There is a stick, a metal stick that goes down into your oil pan and has little markings on it. Let's say desired range. It's kind of like there's one line and another in between it. They used to have like a hatch mark on it. If your oil level, as measured by the stick, because the stick would go down into the oil and the oil would adhere to the stick, and when you pulled it out, this is pretty low tech, right? But it works. When you pulled it out, you could see the oil level, and you wanted to do this when the engine was cool and just sitting there, because when an engine is running, the oil gets coated onto various parts of the engine. But in order to measure how much oil you really have, you want it all in your oil pan. Anyway, the recommendation was that every time you got gas, which was pretty often back then, all the cars had like 20-gallon gas tanks because gas mileage was usually in the 8 to 15 miles per gallon range. Yeah, single-digit gas mileage was not a rarity, especially with the bigger engines, the big V8s and the overpowered Novas. So yeah, you needed to check your oil, and it was fairly common that your engine, either through leakage or burning, because the oil would leak past the piston rings and get burned, and exhausted with the engine exhaust. It wasn't unusual that you'd have to add a quart of oil when you stop for gas. That would happen like every 3 or 4 months. Yeah, so there was that. Let me see how these fit. What I'm most interested in is whether they're symmetric. So when this one fits, it leaves a little gap here, a little gap on the front. If I line it up on the back, it slides back and forth. Great, See. Close. So when you put these in, one thing that's obvious is that the tab is much smaller than the slot. So not only is there a visible seam all around it, okay, it will have to be sanded down once this is attached. But there's a gap there that I think I'll end up filling in. Lube oil filter, tune-ups, points and plugs, check your oil. That was in the day too when you could not pump your own gas. It just didn't happen. And so people got jobs working at filling stations. We called them that because that's where you filled up. Either a filling station or a service station, depending on whether, in fact, they did repairs there or not, or whether they just sold. What I'm finding is, okay, so I'm readjusting this here. What I'm doing is that as I put this in, the tab didn't fit all the way in. And so it kind of like rocked a little bit. Okay, put it in like this, and it didn't go all the way down to the bottom. This is confirming my decision that I'm going to cement this on before doing any kind of priming or painting, so that I can take care of the seams and the gaps. Paying attention to the model here. Okay, well, those fit pretty well. Well, I've got this in my hand. I might as well take care of this. Just little bits of plastic along the edge. Well, that I might just leave that there. It's just a little bit of flashing that sticks up. And I might just, since I'm going to have to sand down these seams after it's cemented together, I think I'll just do that. I'll just leave it there until then rather than trying to get rid of it now. It'll just be safer because then the seam will be even across. If I try to do this now, I could end up rounding the edge, and then it would be a problem. Okay, what I've got here on the bottom, though, are these little bits of plastic sticking out there, and there, and those are from where they were attached to the trees. That held it all together for the injection molding. So then you'd go in for your tune-up, and you'd get your LOF. People got real good at that, you car talk. What you want, mister? Oh, usual lube oil filter, points and plugs, check the belts and the air filter. Okay. It'll be done in, it wasn't sometimes it was a while you wait. Sometimes there was a lot of friends dropping off friends. People didn't have 2 or 3 cars in their family, right? There was one family car, the family car, and you need to get a ride to and from the auto place. So friends were giving people rides to the auto repair place, the garage, the service station. Sometimes you'd go to the dealership. Most people in my neighborhood didn't because they charged more. So the dealership always charged more than the independent the service station. And besides, the owner of the service station was a friend of a friend, and you could sit around and chat for a while when you dropped off your car or picked it up. So there was that. Anyway, yeah. Tires would last, I don't know, 15, 20,000 miles. Just like I was saying, the materials weren't that good. Things wore out a lot faster then. And so parts needed to be replaced that we don't even think of replacing anymore. You don't think of lubing a bearing. You hardly ever think of replacing a belt or changing out the spark plugs. Until you go to the dealership and they say, well, you're hitting 60,000 miles here. You should probably replace the spark plugs. And you go, huh, what? Why would I do that? And it says, well, they wear out. Well, no, I didn't know that. How much is that going to be? And then you complain about something you hadn't thought of. Yeah, and you don't have points anymore because the electronic ignitions came in, and instead of a little rotating hand, hi. Well, the painting, I didn't do much painting today. I painted the insides of these little rocket nozzles black. I managed to get that done. But most of the stuff I'm doing today is fixing the plastic part so that they are presentable and usable. And so I'm doing filing and sanding. I know it's not all that much fun watching this, but it has to be done because these parts don't always fit together very well. Some of these parts, like these, don't fit at all. They were very badly done. But it's coming along okay. It's kind of slowly. This is sort of relaxing as long as I don't gouge anything. But thanks for joining in. This is the back of the Lunar Excursion module. So what's interesting is when back in the day when we grew up with the Apollo, when I grew up with it, this was it was initially called the Lunar Module. There was the command module, the CM, and the service module, the SM, and the lunar module, the LM. But somewhere along the way, it became the Lunar Excursion module. So it's called the LEM, which was it was just fun to say. Oh, it's the LEM. When Well, thank you. It is kind of, when you're watching art being made of any kind, it's like you can't really tell what's going on because for a good deal of the time, it looks like nothing is happening. So there's these little tiny tabs of plastic that are on the edges of the model. When you get the model, these things are attached because of the injection molding. These things are attached to what we call the tree or the screw. I've got some here. Let me show you how this is. This is why I'm doing it. And you get these basically it's waste plastic. And they put little tabs on with numbers so you can tell what different parts there are, but they're like attached to this. And the points where they're attached they're not very big, and you can actually break them off easily. You have to be careful doing that because you don't want to break it off into the model. Okay, which is why when I do this, there's always excess plastic on the outside because I cut them off so that it leaves a little bit of plastic because it's a lot easier for me at least, to file and sand off the excess plastic. Yeah, it is. And in this case, it's really true. There are some little things that are problematic. But I find it's easier to sand this down to get rid of that excess plastic than it is trying to fill in a hole, especially since I haven't found anything that's a really good filler yet. So I use a file to get rid of most of it and then sand it down using a sort of coarse sandpaper and then polish it. So each step kind of gets rid of the scratch marks left by the preceding step, but it's slow. Okay. So I'm sitting here and it's taking like 10 minutes to get rid of these 3 little spots of plastic. And I can use my fingernail to feel if I got it off. But I'm trying to do, like, as I said, when I grade myself, I know I can't do A-level modeling. I'm just not that good at it. I don't have the skills or the practice, or at this point in my life, the manual dexterity to do that kind of work. But if I were to just take this model and like I would when I was a kid, what I would have done was just, I'm not sure what I would have done about these plastic parts. I think I would have sanded them down probably. I probably actually would have taken a razor blade, a single-sided razor blade, and just cut them until they were gone. And that would leave all sorts of divots and things. And then I would slap them together with model cement, which would, come out of a tube and have all sorts of stringy things. I'd probably get it on my finger and leave a fingerprint on it. Oh, well, yeah. Woodworking can be kind of fun and relaxing, but if you're going to, it's one of those things that if you get serious at it, you end up spending just thousands of dollars on tools. I mean, huge amounts of money on bandsaws and table saws and planers and joiners and drill presses. And unless you've got a workshop of significant size, unless you want to go old school, and you can, and just do everything with hand tools. I kind of did that. I mean, since I never had a woodworking shop, whenever I did anything in wood, nothing big like picture frames or stands or something like that. But we did woodworking in grade school, had an opportunity to learn some of those things. Never had a band sander or anything like that, so everything was done by hand. Which is okay, because when you do everything by hand, you really get to know the wood. pretty much gone. So I'm just looking at this piece, like there's this little bits of plastic all around the edges. That when I put the two parts together, I'll sand that down to kind of even out the seams. So I think I got the pieces here. And then this one is mostly okay. There's a little bit, there's some roughness to the windows, the window frames. Do this really delicately. There's just some excess plastic sticking out over the window frames. And that's going to show against the window. Not finding a really good way to get to those. Let me see what I can do. Get the little ridge of plastic off, but not change the not mess up the frame. Bit in the corner there. I've got a little triangle file here. Oh, okay. Well, let me explain what's happening here. Dyson Dungeons is does a D&D show, and we stream with a live chat on Sundays, 3 Sundays a month, and prior episodes are all on YouTube. So I would encourage you, if you like Dyson Dungeons and Dragons at all, or even if you don't, to catch them, because we do a really good show. And this particular stream started out because we make our own dungeon tiles and painted them here on this stream. Well, actually, no, we just started painting them for our campaign, but then decided to stream it. So I'm going to stop here for a moment and show you what this stream was all about. Because our dungeon tiles are really cool. So the reason I'm working on this model, and the reason I worked on the submarine model before this, if you look at prior streams on YouTube, you would see me working on a 1960s vintage model of a submarine. So I paint minifigs, and like this giant moss monster. Having ideas and getting around to actually pulling them off. So, yeah, I have to say, I am vintage. I started playing D&D like a year after it came out, which tells you where I was at. So, sometimes you'd run into a Quetzalcoatl boss, right? So we would paint one up so that when we did our show, we would actually have minifigs on camera doing this. Thank you. I appreciate that. I don't have our characters here, but our character models are also like little minifigs like this. And then, we'd run into things. Sometimes you'd run into a giant toad. We just have some generic kinds of monsters as well. So the stream started because we produce our own dungeon tiles, and I'll show those in a bit, and our minifigs. And it was, we're sitting here down in the basement. It isn't a workshop. It isn't that even. It's just a workbench. And we would paint these things, and our DM said, well, let's stream that too. And I said, that's a dumb idea. Why would I do that? And he said, well, you're painting anyway, so do you mind if I put up a camera and a microphone? And I said, no, whatever. And so we started by doing minifigs and dungeon tiles and streaming it because those are things we would use in our campaign. And then when I ran out of minifigs and dungeon tiles to paint, our DM said, well, you want to keep the stream going, why don't you pull out one of your old models that laying around? And I've got like 36 models that I bought when I retired and never got around to. And so I just started doing that. It used to be just on Wednesdays, but until we get another pile of things that need to be prepped for our show, I'm working on this Apollo model. And what this is it's this. It's the entire Apollo stack. And so far I finished the escape tower and the service module part, and I'm working on the lunar module now, and I've got the parts for this fairing sitting in a box over there that I need to assemble. So slowly but surely I'm getting this done. And it's really cool when it's done. All the parts separate and you can recreate the Apollo mission. But these are samples of our dungeon tiles, and we print them on our PLA printers back here. So these are all like custom made for our show. And they're produced in a solid piece like this. It's done in usually black PLA, and then prime them. And that's done with a spray booth over there that we don't stream because there's no camera there. But then they're base coated, okay? And then details are put in, and then usually they're kind of washed with a dark wash to make them look like they're worn. But the really cool thing about these tiles is that under the base here, each in the corners, there are little ball magnets. Oh, yeah. Oh, but a remote control car is really cool. Ball magnets. And so what it means is that they attach to each other. Look at that. See? And you can take them apart and reattach them in practically any kind of orientation. And they're pretty cool because you don't need a special surface or anything because they attach to each other and not to a surface. And so once you build enough of these pieces, you can do all sorts of different kinds of dungeon settings for the show. So these are stone, and the other ones I'll show you are this. If you want, like this would be for like a castle or a keep or a dungeon or something. These are made to look like wood, so they're great for warehouses and taverns, manor houses, that kind of thing. And they're done the same way. They're printed, the horizontal and verticals as one solid piece. And then we prime them. These are base coated kind of a beige color. And then there's these different colors of inks or washes. And there's one that's sort of dark brown with some red in it. It really brings out the wood grain. So that's what I used to do when I had these things, is this stream would basically show me base coating all of these. Great fun doing that. And then detailing them, washing them, and then painting the stucco parts. Yeah, you could do that, right? Glued sand to it. You can get this modeling grass. It's usually sold for railroads. It's like really fine-grained green things that you can, if you put cement down or just like glue or something, you could glue onto it. Yeah, so this is the kind of dungeon tiles we do. They have neat features like opening doors that work, chests that open. So it just depends on how realistic you want to make it, which depends on how much time you want to take to do it. So these, they feel like when you're doing these, it feels like it takes forever. But when I've watched videos of us painting these, especially base coating, it goes really fast. Some of the things like detailing the little bits of stucco in here, okay, sometimes those take a little while to do. But the way to manipulate these is really cool. So we've got all sorts of things like minifigs for bosses, of NPCs or friendly characters. We've got opening doors. We've got special. I don't know if there's one here. There's one. This has a built-in cauldron. Yeah, yeah. Part of the thing of this particular stream, this thing that I'm doing is sometimes we just sit and watch paint dry. It's like I can't do anything until the paint is dry. What are we going to do? We wait for the paint to dry, right? So these cauldrons are pretty cool because you can put a little magnet, tiny magnet down in the base of this, and then you take like this. There's one here, a flame, and put a magnet in the base of that. There's a little hollow there. And when your fire mage says flame on, the DM can take the flame and set it in there, and the magnet will hold it. You know, or if your water mage says fountain on, you take one of those that's painted to make it look like water fountain and put it in. And so when we do our show and we get into a setting like this, on the stream that we record and put on Twitch and later on YouTube, can actually see these things happening. You know, we've even talked about maybe making these for sale. I don't know if that's ever going to happen or not. I'm kind of hoping it would, because then we're going to mass producing these here, and then I will be painting dungeon tiles on the stream instead of the Apollo model, which would be more appropriate. So that's why I'm building this model, is that right now we have all of the dungeon tiles we need for our show, and there aren't any new characters coming on anytime soon, so we don't need minifigs for those. So I'm just doing basically the building a model stream. And a lot of the time building this model is spent just cleaning it up. So because the parts are not very well formed, they're not well done. They're injection molded, and the injection molding process leaves a lot to be desired. So you end up with like these bits of plastic that get in the way of the parts fitting together properly. Yeah. Anyway, I'll test that. Or these little bits like this right here, okay, that need to be yeah, what we're talking about is selling them because they are really cool. And if unfortunately, well, we could sell them just printed with the magnets in the base without painting them. But what we talked about was like if somebody wanted a painted set, that we could paint it on the stream and a person could watch their own dungeon being prepared before they get it. And they know when it would be done because they could watch it being painted. The stone ones are, they're fairly easy to paint. I really like the wooden ones though, because they look really, really nice. But we've got like 3 printers here, so we could, it's not like a workshop. It's not like a factory. It'd all be like custom made. But, it would be possible. In theory, it's possible anyway. Yeah, wouldn't it be cool? It's like somebody commissions, I would like a necromancy lair, like the one that's under me right now. Okay, with a door and a green pool in the middle, and we'd print the parts and prime them, and then somebody could watch this stream as they were painted and prepared. That pool, the pool in the middle is pretty cool. There's this, it's one solid piece, one big 4 by 4 inch piece, and it can, what we do, the process is really pretty cool. It's put a base coat down on the bottom of the pool of whatever base color, purple or green or something, and then fill it with this plastic rosin, and then mix the paint into the rosin so it looks like it's swirling. 2 or 3 different colors, and it just kind of, they diffuse through the plastic kind of all on their own, so it doesn't require very much hand mixing at all. But they diffuse in the plastic, and you can't really tell because it's pretty tiny on the screen, but it comes out looking pretty amazing. And then it takes a while. It takes like 2 days for the plastic rosin to harden. We discovered that kind of the hard way. The first time we used it, it was like, this stuff is not setting up at all. But then 2 days later, it was fine. You could touch it without leaving fingerprints all over, which is what we did the first time. You know, how do you test things, right? Oh, you just touch it with your finger. Not the best way to do it. But that's what we did. And we found out that it doesn't harden immediately. But once we learned how to do it. Well, here's a sample. We tested it. Oh, neat. One shots are actually kind of fun. Here's an example. We tested everything in a bottle cap before we tested it on our plastic models to see if it would work. So you could see what happens. You know, you put a dot of black paint in, and it just sort of oozes out. It diffuses through the plastic rosin before it hardens. So we were able to get a really cool effect. You're going to be streaming it. That's cool. So you're going to be doing it with other players then? How many folks are you going to have with you? Yeah, I'm kind of curious about, how many players you're going to have, and you don't tell me what you're going to be doing, because that would, give away the whole one-shot arc, and the players need to discover that as they play. Yeah, you really need 3. We found that. We tried to play with like 2 players, the DM and 2 players, and it's just not interesting. Our particular group now has 3 players, 3 real people players, and then the DM introduces some, I'll call them NPCs, but they are like regular members of our party. 4 is a good sized group. So do they have characters already designed, or is that still yet to come? Like the player type and. Okay, I'll test fit these pieces and see how we're doing here in terms of getting these ready to put together later. Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, there's a gap there where the plastic didn't quite match up. Yeah, the seams don't align perfectly. There's still a lump there, and I didn't get that off completely. I was wondering about that. I'm going to do that, work on that just a little bit more now, and then finish it when the parts are put together. Being a DM, I've never really been a DM. I have to say that I played D&D a lot. The first time I played it was actually in the 1970s when it first came out, the mid 70s. We actually have a mint condition boxed set. The first ones came out like in a plastic bag kind of, but then they produced a boxed set, and we have a mint condition first edition boxed set of Dungeons and Dragons, complete with the really crappy dice that came with it. So, yeah. So I've been playing a long time, and I've played. So have you been playing in that campaign? Are you a player in that campaign? There's always been somebody around who wanted to be a DM, who really likes doing that and gets very creative scenarios going. So it was like, yeah, whatever. I'll be a player in your campaign. That should be fun. Let's do it. So, yeah, I've never DM'd my own session, but I've played. Oh, my. Okay, what we have here, I'm just looking around at the model and looking for flaws, and there is a divot here. There's a spot right here. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, that's good. Our DM is really stingy with levels. I think in the campaign that we're running for our show, I think we were at level 1 for like 6 months, and we do it once a week. We finally have leveled up to level 9, but it's taken us like 115 sessions or something to get to that point. I'm not quite sure why we weren't allowed to level up. We started actually to believe that leveling was a lie, that it was something that just could not happen, because it just didn't happen on our show. But as you level up, the bad downside about leveling up is that the DM can get nastier. Start throwing things at you that you couldn't survive before. And then if you roll like I roll and get a lot of 3s, okay, that's the way the game should be played. Okay, is the DM should set up the scenario for you, and they think about it, and they think it's really wonderful and clever and dangerous and all of that. And then as a players, you wander off, right? In our game, we're going through town, and all of a sudden we see a pretzel stand. Why? I don't know. We say, "Is there a pretzel stand here?" Right? It's like, why would you say that? Well, because we like pretzels. So you say, is there a pretzel stand here? So what can the DM do? The DM will roll a D100, right? And it turns up and the DM goes, I can't believe it. Yes, there's a pretzel stand. Okay, because the DM can't. The dice have to make a difference, and so, yeah, we spend the next half hour, asking the pretzel vendor what kind of pretzels they have and what kind of salt do they use on their pretzels, and we taste them to see whether or not the pretzels are amazing or not. And then, yeah, all of a sudden we've had a pretzel episode. And the DM had spent like 3 days preparing an encounter that we finally get to at the end of the episode. And the best thing is exactly what you said. Is there's a big encounter. You know, you run into a traveling band of bandits or something, right? And yeah, instead of having the epic battle that the DM was planning, you just, you know, your druid casts persuasion or something and rolls a d20. What's the DM going to do then, right? You gotta follow the dice. Or you've got a wizard or something and it polymorphs one of the characters, one of the attackers. We've done that too. It's really kind of fun. Okay. So yeah, so instead of, you know, getting into a fatal battle where you would have been destroyed because you're like outnumbered and overwhelmed. Yep. Congratulations on that. That's like that is how D&D is the most fun. When sometimes you don't have a fight, but you figure out how to get through it without a battle, and you can do things that are do something that's almost impossible. You know, it's sometimes depending on your abilities and your spells and your role, right? Because you know, sometimes you roll a one, you just do. Um, you can even get an antagonistic party member to join your side, or to decide that they need to, you know, they need to go home and make dinner, and they just leave the battle scene. Sometimes those are the most fun parts. Is, you know, I wouldn't say outwitting the DM. That's not the point, but using something other than just battle abilities to get through a situation. So it sounds like you've got a pretty good group and that they're very creative. Right. That's exactly what happens, right? My character in the D&D show that we're doing is a Furbog fighter, also wearing armor. And so I was constantly giving the party away because I would roll like fours or whatever, and clanging, and we would be found out. And so it got to almost become a kind of a running joke that my character had, you know, the stealth ability of like jetliner taking off, right? So what I ended up doing is, as I leveled up, you can get proficiency and expertise. Is I actually now have expertise in stealth. Maybe not the best choice of things for a fighter. You know, there are probably other things that would have been much more useful. Now that's pretty cool. Everybody complains about rogues though, because rogues are way too overpowered. You know, so you're a fighter and you're doing the tank thing and doing your best, and you know, hitting for fairly decent damage against a boss fight kind of situation. And then the rogue comes in and like just all of a sudden does 6 times more damage than in one turn than you've been able to do like in 5. Just rogues are just like that. They'll just be overpowered, but they're kind of fun to play. Really, you're a ghost? You got some ghost-touched armor? One of my favorite characters was a ghost. I was a ghost pirate, dwarf ghost pirate bard. And of course, a pirate could make sense to be a bard, right? Always singing sea shanties and stuff. I was a spoken word bard because I can't sing, and we were playing and trying to be in character as much as possible. But the only sea shanties, the only songs that my bard character knew were theme songs from 1950s and 60s television shows. So I'd get into a spoken word version of the Gilligan's Island theme or the Mr. Ed theme or the Yogi Bear theme. I never finished them. Everybody told me to shut up. But being a ghost is a lot of fun. Being able to go through walls and whatever. I was very, very good at spying things out. Neat. Yeah. That's another part of D&D that's really important. Mm-hmm. That sometimes people miss, which is the backstory of the characters. If you just go into it and you're just doing a whole lot of combat, that can be kind of fun. But if it's a longer campaign, to be able to do that. So in our campaign, my character didn't have much of a backstory. I turned out to be like an orphan furbog because my village disappeared one day. Just disappeared. Never found out why. Not yet, anyway. And then became an apprentice of an elven cult. Didn't know it, but this guy just showed up in my village and turned me into his apprentice. And so I've been learning the backstory of that whole thing from the DM and then combining it with my backstory. And the good DM will be really good at either playing along with a character, a player, developing their own backstory, or they'll be pretty good at revealing your backstory as you go along. But losing your memory and then learning about your backstory is pretty fun. My Ghost Pirate Bard didn't know he was a ghost. And, didn't remember being killed and turning into a ghost. And so it was kind of fun, at least initially, eventually learned how to be a ghost. The most important part was getting ghost-touched rum. As a pirate, that was critical. But, we spent a good deal of time learning. That character spent a good deal of time learning that it was a ghost. We never finished. We didn't get very well. We got a long way into the campaign, but then the players couldn't get together anymore on a regular basis, and the DM did this. I don't know. It was really brutal. It was like we got caught up in a civil war between angels and demons. Really, it was like, well, we couldn't possibly survive this. You know, no matter what level we were at, there was no way that we could possibly survive that situation. But it all kind of ended then, so we never know if we did survive or not. Never found out because of that. But it was fun being a ghost character and not knowing I was a ghost, and then figuring out how to adapt to it. My first clue that something was amiss, and this was like in episode 1 or 2, was that I was at a bar and I couldn't drink the rum. It kept dribbling onto the floor, and I didn't understand why. Okay, well, that's appropriately dark for that kind of character. So let me ask, um, was the rumor true, or were you being like set up by a rival band or jealous players in your town, or did you actually do something that should have led to your banishment? And did they come and pursue you? Was that part of the campaign? And your backstory is that they actually came out after you, or were you okay once you left? So you're lucky though to have a DM that encourages and embellishes backstories and makes them a real part of the campaign, instead of something they just get impatient with. And that's really cool that you've got that setting and situation. I'm just doing more filing and sanding, trying to get this part to be presentable. It's got all sorts of flaws from the molding process. And it's pretty delicate. It's already broken. It broke before I even started working on it. So, yeah. Mm. And they believe the jealous student. Okay. Well, rumors can get out of control like that. Not just in the game, but in real life. So that was actually an interesting kind of situation that was created there. So the whole town got upset and came out after you. It's a good reason to leave. Biggest problems with this is that the injection molding, these are supposed to be like round struts, right? The injection molding process left these little lines along the sides, and they're kind of hard to get off without breaking the part even more than it's already broken. Really, it's not very thick plastic, but it's sometimes in places like this down in the corner where it's just hard to reach. This one's really bad in terms of not being round. Yeah, that's that's always an interesting part of a campaign is the meeting up of adventurers. There's always the you're all sitting around in a tavern and you overhear each other's stories and you decide to join up kind of thing. But sometimes just even that can become a really interesting part of the campaign. The meeting up can become part of the backstory of everybody. So I'm hoping that you've had some campaigns where that was done in a very kind of clever and an interesting way. It's been so long now. Well, they all helped out. That was good. They didn't let you die before you even got to level 2. It's been so long now, I can't remember how our party met up. Well, that's weird. Of course, it's not too surprising that I can't remember something because, old. But yeah, I'm really curious now about how we met. I'll have to ask the younger members, and everybody else in the party is younger. To be honest, everybody is younger anyway. Like, where did all these young people come from? Well, it's because everybody's younger than you know. Oh, yeah, right. Okay. I guess I have to live with that. Um, so one shot. Sometimes one shots can be, just if the DM is willing to create one, you just get together for like a weekend or something, or just even one night and play it through. It's a just good way to spend some time. I haven't had, been a lot. I've been in a couple of campaigns that have lasted like maybe 8 to 10 sessions, not really long ones. They were designed to be kind of time limited. Like there was literal, the trope, the cliche. There was a quest, and then there were some side quests and some distractions and things like that. But then the quest got completed and the campaign was over, and that was okay. We would start out maybe at a level 5 or something, so that gameplay could be a little bit more complicated, not hugely, so that there was still room for improvement. Maybe we'd level up 3 or 4 times during the course of the campaign. Because of what was going to be happening and how we had to be prepared for it. But and then a couple of one shots we did. You should check this out. I think it was called The Haunting at Hawthorne Manor. Oh yeah. Well, you have to become a tavern owner. I mean, that is a requirement of D&D. Although if any of our characters retired, they'd probably open like a pretzel shop, like I was saying, because there's this, for some reason, we have a fascination that started early on in the campaign with pretzels. It actually happened because somebody, I don't know, they told this story where they went into kind of a shop and the person behind the counter had to wish them some sort of a day, like have a croissant day or something like that. So we went to a pretzel shop and we just jokingly said, "Did I have a pretzel day?" Which means, an amazing day. So we'd roll a d20 to see if we had a pretzel day or not. I got a nat 20 once, so that was it was a wonderful pretzel day. And on them. So they were camping out, and you walked in as a ghost. Were you like in a visible ghostly form? I can't see very well. That's why I'm leaning over. So he would retire basically by attempting to figure out how he got to be where he was or what he was. That's pretty good. I like that. I'm going to have to take a break because I just need to take a break. Just had a big cup of coffee a little while ago. I'm going to finish this piece, cleaning it up a little bit more, and then sanding it a little bit. And I'll probably be well, that's pretty cool. So they thought you were just somebody because you were wearing full plate until they discovered that there wasn't any you in it because you were Ghost. Okay, I really like that. That's very clever. That's a clever way of introducing yourselves and for them to get to know you. Sounds like you're all very creative and have a lot of fun playing. The DM must have a lot of fun too, being amused by and sometimes like annoyed by the stuff that you do. Thanks for the follow. I appreciate that. Oh my. Okay. Well, thank you for hanging in so late in the day. I appreciate it, and join in on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays from like 10 until 2, almost all days, almost every week. So thanks again. Thanks for the follow. I really appreciate it. And have fun with your campaign. It sounds like you're having a lot of fun. Hope you found this relaxing. So everybody else who wasn't in on the conversation, I'm working on these antenna struts, which were the two halves of the molds didn't match, I guess I should say. And as a result, there's just this line of plastic down each side. And I've been just sort of filing and sanding it away so that they are mostly round. This particular piece is broken. Right on the end here, there's a piece that's supposed to be perpendicular. You can kind of see there where this extends, where it's supposed to be attached. Well, it came out of the mold unattached. It was just flopping around and then broke off. And I am going to cement it on after break, assuming I remember to do that. So, as usual, I'm getting At the beginning of the stream, I listed like a whole bunch of stuff that I would be potentially working on. And I am getting, I don't know, maybe half of it done. Some of these things just take forever. So this little bit of plastic here, a little bit of plastic is supposed to be there at a 90-degree angle so that it can fit into a hole that is way too big for it on the top of the lunar module. And of course, it isn't like there's a hole in one of the pieces. No, the hole is made up of two halves that have to come together. This is why I don't use CA cement. See, even test fitting, I can't get the parts together. Anyway, this thing goes like this. Okay, those little struts, cement down there, and this one on top is supposed to go into that hole. The diameter of the plastic is like half the diameter of the hole. So it's going to leave this big opening that I'm going to have to somehow fill in and then touch up somehow. I don't know. The alternative, actually, I'm actually thinking of doing this. I might end up doing this. Okay. So instead of putting the perpendicular on and fitting it into a hole that's twice its diameter, I'm just going to fill the hole in. Just going to fill the hole in and cement this on like that. Maybe I'll do that. Maybe I'll stick this on. But then, I was thinking if I cement this on and then fill the hole, it will mess up the painting, because when I couldn't fill the hole until this was cemented on, and this would already be painted. If I put the 90-degree angle thing on, and didn't fill the hole in until after that was in, I suppose it's possible. But I'm looking at this and I'm saying the easiest way to do this, since it has to be cemented on anyway, is just fill in the hole and attach the antenna like that, because it has to be attached down at the bottom anyway. I mean, in terms of how it looks, that's just what I'm going to do. Now, there was a big flaw here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. There's a divot there. I am actually going to put some filler in that now, and hopefully I'll remember it later. Maybe I won't, because I can't find it. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to leave this piece just sitting here like this so I remember to do that. But I do need to take a break. I will be back. I'll try to be back in like 20 minutes by 1 o'clock, and then we'll run another hour of getting almost nothing done on this model. No. Okay. Back from break. Actually, it was only about 22 minutes, shorter than usual. And so I'm back now, and I'm going to continue getting almost nothing done on this Apollo model as I'm just trying to get the parts to fit. Well, there's a divot here, and I'm going to fill this in. And as usual, it's just there's always this issue of what to use to fill it, and I'm going to use a spackling compound, even though it doesn't polish quite. I mean, you're going to be able to see that there's a spot there, regardless of what I do. We will see the spot, but it won't be a hole. And sometimes that's just a compromise that has to be made, because the other filler that I have doesn't sand well. You know. So I'll let that dry. And it's just a tiny spot. And I'll let that dry, and then I'll turns white when it dries, and then sand it down. And there's that. There's a couple other spots, but I'm not going to try to mess with them. Well, there's just so much to be done on this model that it's hard to tell where to start. This piece now, this antenna, is adequately, I think, as much as I can, reasonably. Yeah, maybe not. Maybe I'll mess with it a little bit more. Just trying to get the seams off. And this was injection molded. There's seams down along the sides of these struts. And they're just there. And when this is painted metallic, they would be very visible. So I'm sanding them off as well as I can. These flaws are going to be on the bottom. I'll be able to prime this, and then I can add it to the pile of these other two antennae that are going to be hand painted. Okay. And the hatch is going to be hand painted too. I'm going to paint it a slightly different color than the body of the LEM. I'm not sure when we started calling it the LEM. Initially, it was just LM to go along with CM for command module and SM for service module. And then the Apollo story booklet says that it was called the bug because it is kind of insect-like when you look at it from the front, right? And it had spindly legs down under here. There's spindly legs, so it looked kind of insect-like. But then I don't recall ever really calling it the bug. We all called it the LEM, an excursion module, instead of LIM without a vowel. And then the command module, we just called it the capsule. That's the capsule. That's what they started calling it. Back in the Mercury day. Okay, well, I'll stop messing with this. This I can prime separately too, so it can be painted. I'll just set it here. These parts I'm going to attach to the module before I prime it. They're just going to be cemented on because they just create more seams that need to be addressed before the whole thing is primed altogether. So I guess if we wanted to see something actually happen, I could probably cement these parts on today. I might just go ahead and do that. The other thing I've got to do, the other thing I have to do is clean these bits up, and that's going to be, they're small and tiny and all of that, and it's just kind of a chore. I might start on like one of the easier ones. Okay, just cleaning up the surfaces and getting rid of the seams. trying to preserve the contact points for the. I might try this one that's still got the contact points on it. The other one, they're lost on the top and the bottom. But I'd like to have them at least on one so I can see where they're supposed to go. So let me just do some cementing now. What the heck? I mean, just get something done, right? Make it look like something's happening. These little, right? This is good. Just do this. Just make a mess, right? So these parts just go on here, and the important thing is to get them so that it's like at the same level, right, on the top here, so that it's like even. So I want to be able to stick this on and manipulate it a little bit before the cement sets. Is there an issue with this? Yeah, this is going to be one of those things where I put cement in and then it just needs to be held tightly in place for a while because the parts like don't exactly fit together very well. So I'm just going to use the liquid cement in the squeeze bottle and then hold it tightly in place like this, essentially, and then do the same thing on the other side. And then when worst comes to worst, I'll just be doing a lot of sanding here to get rid of any irregularities, okay, so that it will end up looking seamless. At least that's the intent. And I'm going to be using my finger to kind of feel this. Maybe I will not use my finger. Maybe I will use because I know that if I put my finger on it, what I'm saying is what I want is this to be lined up, right? I want this to not be above or below the surface. And so if I put my finger across it, there's going to be cement there. And I'll get it on my finger and I'll spread it around and it will just totally screw up the surface. So, and then when I push on it, it'll slide. So, yeah, this will be a little bit, it's a little bit kind of difficult there. Down here. This is down here, it just doesn't fit against it. It's like a little warped or something. The top is the most important part. This is the most visible. So this is where I want it to line up the most. And then secondarily down at the bottom. Fortunately, there's a fair amount of plastic here. So if I mess it up, I should be able to sand it out. Okay, well, at least there'll be some accomplishment. It'll look like something got done. And you will hardly even notice it. You'll hardly even notice that these were attached because it just isn't going to show very much. It's liquid cement to the edges here. At least that's what I'm assuming is happening. It's hard to see it. Definitely want to make sure that it's across the top because that cement has to like fill the gap. Okay, and with this stuff, it needs to go on both edges. Well, let's hope this works. To not get it on my fingers as much as I can avoid getting it on my fingers. And there's some gaps down at the bottom that need to be filled in. That's not a surprise, is it? Almost as much fun as watching paint dry is you're all going to watch me hold this in place for the better part of 2 minutes while the cement sets enough so that it will hold when I let it go. Counting down 2 minutes. You can count with me. 33, 34, 35, 36. That's pretty boring. Well, I don't know. I'm not going to be able to count down 2 minutes because it's just going to be too boring. So what I'm going to do is talk more about old car maintenance. So, talked about oil changes, lube oil filter, and how we don't do lube anymore. Talked about how we just dumped the old oil just anywhere, like even down the sewer, right? That was a clever thing to do. Talked about having to check your oil every time you got gas because cars leaked and burned oil regularly. So it was not unusual that every couple of months you had to add a quart. Yep, car's down a quart. Okay, put it in. What? Do you want no, just use the cheap stuff. We were always pinching pennies. Talked about points and plugs. Talked about refurbishing spark plugs by filing off all the carbon and lead that accumulated on the plugs. Talked about distributor caps and points and how there was basically a mechanical ignition that depended upon a rotating pointer making contact with little dimples, little dots of metal to send electricity to the spark plugs, and how the timing had to be right and how it all had to be adjusted. Didn't talk about carburetors yet. We don't even have those anymore. And old ones, and that was where the air came in and mixed with the fuel inside of these things, and they were filled with tiny little holes that had to be that sometimes needed to be adjusted, and a butterfly valve that adjusted the amount of air that came in. That was supposed to somehow be controlled by a vacuum on the car and the temperature of the engine. And in the cars I had, it never worked. It was a disaster. One car, we had 4 carburetors installed, and none of them worked. So we actually should have put on a manual choke. A manual choke was the valve. It was called a butterfly valve. It was like a flap on the top of the carburetor, and it could either close almost completely, in which case there was very little air getting into the engine. It was mainly just fuel, so it was rich. It was called a rich mix because it was rich in fuel. And when it was opened completely, a lot of air got in and mixed with the fuel, and that was lean mix. And the mix of fuel, how much fuel was going into the engine, had to vary depending upon whether it was like just starting and what the temperature was and that sort of thing. So the automatic choking means that if the valve was closed, it was choking the engine, right? the automatic choke was supposed to automatically open or close the butterfly valve depending upon like the engine, like the how open the throttle was and what the temperature of the engine was and all that. Well, that part didn't work. So you could get a manual choke, which was basically a cable that went from the butterfly valve to a knob inside the car somewhere where you could open and close that valve from inside the car. And we really should have gotten that because we ended up having to open and close the valve from outside the car, which meant opening the hood, taking the air cleaner off, the air filter, and sometimes propping open the butterfly valve with a discarded car part. Okay. It was really annoying, especially in the winter. It really just was not a good feature of that car. So fuel injection made a big difference. That was a really good invention as far as reliability of the engine. Anyway, yeah. So we had carburetors that didn't work. There were some cars that were so finicky that they had these things called needle valves, which determined the air fuel mixture in a fashion, and they were variable. You could vary the size of them. You could replace them, basically. And some of them were so finicky that the needle valve, they needed to be adjusted depending upon the temperature and humidity. You wondered how these machines ever worked at all compared to the way everything is done nowadays. And sometimes they just didn't work at all. Oh well. I mean, that was a reality. Car wouldn't start. You know, you'd call into work and say, car wouldn't start. And, you know, people would believe that because sometimes cars just wouldn't start. Get too much gas in it. You know, like you'd push the accelerator pedal too soon. So too much gas was flowing into the engine. We called that flooding the engine. And a lot of these phrases were literally what was happening is that too much fuel was going into it. And so it wouldn't combust because there wasn't enough air in the air-fuel mixture. And so you flooded the engine, and there wasn't anything you could do. You basically had to wait for the gasoline to evaporate sufficiently. I mean, enough of it to evaporate so that it could get started. I am not doing this well. Okay, well, it's not perfect, but I'll be able to sand that smooth so that the seam here, this one closed up a lot better than the other side. Just some little micro adjustments here, but I'm basically going to be counting on sandpaper to even that out, smooth it out. And the two sides don't fit in the same way. There's a little gap there on this side and none here. On this side, the parts just aren't the same, you know, and that's just how some of these things work. The right side and the left side are not identical. And then there's a gap down at the bottom where the tab goes in. You can probably see it there. I'm going to fill that in. And when it comes time to sand things, that will be something that is sanded. But I'm putting these on because this way I can say that I did something on relaxing, cementing things together with Dyson Dungeons today. I'll hold this again for a minute or two. Yeah, so that kind of stuff was happening with cars. Let's see. Well, there's other bigger things. Brakes. We're all used to disc brakes. We used to have what were called drum brakes, which had nothing at all to do with like drumming, but it had to do with the way the brakes were created. The disc brakes, now there's a disc attached to the wheel, and then there's a set of pads. That's the rotor. The pads basically clamp it, okay, like that. So there's this disc, like this would be the disc, and the clamps, your pads clamp it from both sides, even though you can only see one side when you look at the car. It's two-sided. And that's what stops the car. It grips the disc, and they work really well. And they don't they don't have certain problems that drum brakes used to have. Like if drum brakes got wet and water could get inside the brake, okay, if it could, the way a drum brake worked is that what they meant by a drum was it was like a bowl, kind of more like a cake pan. Okay, so it had straight sides. And then they had these things called brake shoes that were inside of that. And the way it worked is that the shoes were pushed up on the inside of the drum, or this bowl-shaped thing. And just like your pads will wear out on disc brakes, the shoes, the brake shoes, they were just sort of like, and it was 5-inch long curves, so they curved more or less at the same radius as the drum. Those would wear out pretty quickly. That was, back in the day, the shoes which wore away. You wanted the shoes to wear away. You didn't want the drum to wear away, even though it did, and I'll get to that in a bit. Had asbestos in them, so that was good. So the cars back then not only spewed lead into the atmosphere, so especially in cities and city streets where there was a lot of traffic, the air was just full of lead in various and sundry forms, and also asbestos particles from the brake shoes. So we grew up in a really healthy atmosphere. It was the atmosphere. It wasn't healthy. There was a lot of toxic stuff there, especially in cities with traffic. So that was kind of our growing up experience. So these are going to set until Monday, because then I will work on the seams, sand them down, see if the seams still show. Maybe you have to do some filling in, especially like around the base there. I think for the most part, there isn't going to be a gap that needs to be filled in, for the most part. But there will be some seams that need to be evened out. So there, I did two things. Then there's a thing here. I can put this thing on. This thing goes here. Okay, like that. And this ends up holding an antenna. And this is a thing I would like to put on now, because once again, there's seams that I can clean up and fill in. So it's the same sort of thing. I'm going to put cement around the edge, the top and the bottom, and then stick it on and hold it a little bit. So the thing with the brakes, okay, is that they wore out pretty fast, right? So you had to get the brake job. What's that? Well, what the brake job was, you take the wheel off the car, and open up the cover of the brake, and then you take out the bits, take out the parts, and replace the shoes. And if you were lucky, that's all you needed to do. All you needed to do was replace the asbestos shoes. And there was asbestos mixed in with them, at least for a while. Just needed to replace those and then put it back together. And you'd have brakes that wouldn't squeal and would actually stop the car again. Because until you did that, they would squeal, make a horrible high-pitched squeaking sound. That's how you knew you needed the brake job. You could do routine maintenance by just having that done periodically, like on a schedule, or you could just wait for it to be squealing, and then you knew you had to do it. So most people would just wait until they had to. I can't say most people. Some, you just wait. So you'd have, lead of various and sundry forms floating in the atmosphere and little asbestos particles from the brakes, and then you'd also have squealing. So city streets were really kind of fun. And then there'd be all sorts of things leaking, like transmission fluid and oil and stuff would be leaking out of the cars. So there'd be a lot of that on the streets. And then when it rained, it all got flushed into the sewers, along with all the extra oil that people just dumped into the sewers when they changed their own oil. Until health warnings came out saying, please don't do that. This is killing the fish in the lake, and that because the oil that you dumped in the sewers just didn't disappear. We all thought, well, you can't see it, it must be gone. That wasn't exactly true. It had to go somewhere, and it did. It went into like the nearest stream or lake or whatever, because they were storm sewers, not sanitary sewers. But sometimes they were mixed together. Anyway, that was all part of growing up. So when you wonder why old people are the way they are, okay, just remember this, that we all grew up at a time when, especially if you grew up in a city, there was lead in the air all the time from the auto exhaust and the leaded fuel. Okay. And we grew up with that. So if you hear about what the effects of lead poisoning, that's what it was. Yep. Good times. So what else? Yeah. So brake jobs. So you did that. Sometimes people would, just like changing your own oil, it's a lot cheaper to buy the parts for the brakes, to buy new shoes and replace those than it was to pay somebody to do it. And so you jack up the car, maybe put some blocks underneath it so if it fell down, it wouldn't crush you. Although you didn't have to go under the car to work on the brakes. You were on the outside of the car. And you take the wheels off and take the brake cover off and then pull the shoes off and clean all this stuff up, because it was all covered with grease. Everything was covered with this black grease, the same, just a lot of that. And yeah. Oh yeah, I remember this. I actually watched somebody do this once when they were fixing their own brakes, is cleaning the grease off. The thing that was the solvent that was used to clean the grease off of things before you put new grease on, had to clean the old grease off before you put the new grease on, was gasoline. So these parts, and you'd hope that if you were doing it yourself that you'd remember how the parts went together. But this person was, they were pretty good mechanically that way. They remembered where the parts went. But they were just dumped in a coffee can half filled with gasoline. And that cleaned the grease off really well. It dissolved it right away. And what do you do with the grease-filled gasoline, right? I mean, what do you do with that, right? Well, you probably just dumped it down the sewer, I'm guessing. What else can you do with it? Okay, well that's a gap there. That's going to have to be filled in a little bit. So these seams never really completely go away, even if they're filled in, because the spackling compound that I use, which has turned out to be among the things I use the best, has a slightly different surface texture that can't match the plastic, regardless of how finely the sandpaper is used. So anyway, the seams will show a little bit, but it will show as a like a welding seam or something, and not as a gap. So this needs to sit, and after it sits, then I'll do some sanding on the seams and do some filling in the gaps, just like with this other bit. So there, I cemented some stuff in place, and now there are fewer parts because they're attached. How am I doing on time? I got 20 minutes yet, 25 minutes. Well, sometimes your brakes, they couldn't be, I was saying the materials were not as good then. I would say that no material was as good as they are now. At least, if you're using good materials. Sometimes the drums would go bad. The thing against which, so these brake pads, these brake shoes would push out like that against the inside of the brake drum. And sometimes something would get in there, or the pad would get a little uneven, and the inside of the drum would get scored. There would be like gouges in it, right? Well, that wasn't good, because that reduced the surface area of the brakes, and your brakes didn't work as well then. They didn't work as well when they had gouges in them. Go figure. And what you could do then, because replacing the drums those were expensive parts. They were really, they were very hard steel, because they were getting frictioned all the time. That's how brakes worked. And you wanted the shoes to wear away, but you didn't want the drum to wear away, but it did eventually, and sometimes unevenly. So you could turn the drum. You take the drums off, detach them from the axle, and put them on a lathe and smooth out the inside of the drum. They'd shave it away so that the gouges were, if not completely gone, at least significantly minimized. And that way you could avoid it was cheaper, believe it or not. It was actually cheaper to do that than to get new drums. Nowadays, it would be cheaper to get new drums, because if you could even find anybody who could turn your drums, if you could even find someone, it would be pretty expensive. But there are all sorts of ways then of cutting expenses by doing it yourself. But that was something that, if you kept your car for very long or drove it very many miles, you would eventually have to turn your drums in order for your brakes to work. And the way these things were engineered was that, your drum now had a larger inside diameter, but because the shoes were spring loaded, you just have to adjust them a little bit, and they would fit to the new drums. But that was a thing that was pretty routinely done. Replacing the brake shoes was done fairly often. They wore out. Nowadays we consider them like wearing out really fast. There's a divot there. I wonder if the other one has a divot like that. No, I want to fill. I don't know if you can see it just on the side there. There's a hole in the plastic. I'm going to have to fill it in like I did with a tiny bit of that spackling compound. What I'm doing here is I'm filing down the seams, because the parts didn't fit together very, very well. And after I file them down, then I'll polish them with fine-grained sandpaper. But these are there's sufficient amount of plastic here that needs to come off, that filing it at least close to where it needs to be is, we just need to do it that way because otherwise it would take forever if I just used sandpaper. Brakes, but then there's the engine. Okay, and we don't think much about the engines anymore; they just run. But back in the day, there would be fairly commonly done restorative work. There was the engine overhaul. It's kind of a weird kind of sounding, isn't it? But what it was taking the engine apart because parts in the inside wore out so much that they needed to be replaced. And the things that needed to be replaced most often were, if you were lucky, you would just need to get new rings. And the piston goes up and down inside the cylinder, right? We know how that works. But the outside of the piston doesn't come in contact with the inside of the cylinder wall. Okay, the piston's going up and down inside the cylinder. Between the piston and the cylinder wall are rings. There's rings that go into the piston. Okay, and the rings fill the gap. They fill the gap between. I want this to be flat. This is the part that cements into the side of the lem, and if it isn't flat, it's not going to set. It's not going to sit, and it won't. It won't adhere. So so there's these rings on the pistons that fill the gap between the piston and the cylinder wall, and the rings would wear out. You hardly ever see this anymore at all. But again, another thing that used to be common was the car burning oil, and it just produced these clouds of smoke that had a very distinct odor to them. I mean, you knew that it was burning oil because you could not only see it, but you could smell it. And what was happening was that the piston rings were wearing out, and they didn't completely fill the gap, okay, between the piston and the cylinder wall. And so oil was leaking in there. And when the fuel burned, it burned the oil that leaked in as well. So that was a pretty common thing. And it meant that your engine was really close to failing. It also meant that you needed to check your oil, like not every time you got gas, but like every time you stopped, practically. There are even stories that, we had a car like that did burn oil. We needed to put every 100 miles or so, seriously, like every 100 miles or so, we'd have to put a quart of oil in. It was leaking it more than burning it. There weren't big clouds of oil burning, smelling exhaust, but it was leaking pretty significantly because the seal on the oil pan between the oil pan and the engine was never done right. Yeah, and that's another thing we had done like twice, and it never quite fixed the problem. Anyway, so what you could do was you could get new rings, and they would advertise them as oversized rings. So essentially what was happening was that, you didn't always need oversized rings. It depended on how much wear there was on the inside of the cylinder wall. So if if the lubrication wasn't working or for whatever reason, the rings were starting to wear out, to erode the inside of the cylinder wall started getting larger, the cylinder diameter, inside diameter. And one way you could fix that without having to do major work on the engine block, there were actually two ways to fix that, but the most common way was to get oversized rings so that they were a little bit bigger than the original ones. And then because the inside of the cylinder wall was now bigger, the oversized rings would fill the gap. But that was a thing that was fairly commonly done. You take the engine apart and pull the pistons out. They detached on the bottom, unbolt them, and put new rings on them. And if necessary, you would use oversized ones to fill the gap between the piston and the cylinder walls. And then you didn't burn quite as much oil, and your engine lasted a little bit longer. If the damage to the cylinder wall was significant, there were several options. One option was just like you turned the brake drum, to make it even again, you could bore out like the cylinder wall, because usually it was uneven wear. It would become a little bit ovoid, or there would be scars in it from the friction between that and the that's supposed to be there. Another flaw. Okay, from the friction, it would be damaged. Okay, the inside of the cylinder wall could be damaged, in which case you would bore them out by basically running a big drill down it. An inside, instead of an outside lathe, it would be an inside lathe, pretty much. Okay, so that the inside of the cylinder walls would be round again. They would be round and smooth. Not perfectly, but pretty, better than it was. So when they were round and smooth, then you could put your pistons back in, and then you definitely would need oversized rings, because you just made the diameter of the cylinder larger. But that was done in an engine overhaul, and it was not unusual that if you wanted to keep a car much past 50,000 miles, maybe even 40, that you would do an overhaul. And so it was just a thing that happened. It sounds like a huge thing now. To take an engine apart and bore out or, lathe out the insides of the cylinders and put new rings on your pistons and put it all together. But there were places that just did that. Okay, and just overhauled one engine after the other. It's just what they did, because there was enough demand for that. Because if you were lucky, well, maybe because you just drove a lot, okay, your engine would need an overhaul before your body rusted out completely. Yeah. And then when your body rusted out, it was, no matter how well your engine was running, things would start falling out of the inside of your car, and you'd be able to see the road from your seat while you were driving. Things like that did happen. It wasn't that rare. It sounds kind of weird now, but that would happen. So then you'd be able to sell your car for parts. Pretty much all you could do was sell it for parts, and depending on which parts were not totally used up, you'd get, between $500 and $500 for what was left of your car. But engine overhauls, yeah, that was a thing, and it was pretty intense work. Sometimes other things needed to be fixed, like this, where the cylinders attached, the base of the pistons attached to the crankshaft. There were bearings there, and they weren't. I don't think they weren't really roller bearings. They were just kind of sleeves, and those would wear out, and so those would get replaced. That was fairly straightforward. You just put them on the inside of where the piston attached to the crankshaft. If your crankshaft was damaged, like if it were one of the, say, like the lubrication on one of the pistons wasn't working very well, and you ended up like wearing away part of your crankshaft. It was a little bit more. That was starting to get into things. It was pretty hard to repair a crankshaft. You might have to buy a new one. But even then, it became economically feasible. Actually, it made sense. It was cheaper to do something with an overhaul, like replacing a crankshaft, than it would be like buying a whole new car. I think the only people who do that kind of thing now are the ones who have like old vintage cars that they want to keep in as original shape as they can. They have to find highly specialized mechanics who can remember how to do this. I'm just feeling all the seams with my fingernail to make sure that I'm getting them smooth before I start running sandpaper over this. Yeah, these fit into these slots on the side like that. And you can see that that's not exactly the best fit and finish, right? I mean, big gaps all around it. It flops around inside. So that's another opportunity for making it look like a welded seam as opposed to a gap once that's attached. And I'm going to attach those like I did these other parts before I prime and paint this whole thing. So this is looking like it got to the point now where I need to polish it. So I'm going to do that as well as I can. And what I'm trying to do here is get a uniform surface texture, because I want the file marks to disappear. Okay. This is going to be painted in metallic. And so some of that stuff is going to show. This is not as easy to sand because just little nooks and crannies. And I'm holding it in the light like this as much as I can to see the reflectivity, and I want the reflectivity to look as uniform as I can get it. Your sandpaper. All these little bits. It takes, and like if you're watching this, it just takes a long time to get these little bits presentable. If they had been the kind of thing that you just cement them together and maybe sand down where the cement was a little bit on the seam, that would be one thing. But when they don't fit very well and the seams are highly visible ridges, or in some cases gaps, it's a different story altogether, isn't it? Yep. So that's why I'm doing this. In this case, there is actually a divot there too that I said I was going to fill in. Okay, I think then right here. Just a weirdness in the shape right there. Right there in the front where it shows. To discover the divot. Is it not as obvious as I thought it was? Oh, there it is. It's on the inside. Yeah, right there. I'm going to do a little filling in and hopefully remember that it's been filled in and sand it down again before I attach it. I think, just almost, I would just say just about every moving part on a car until almost the 90s or so, you just needed to replace it periodically. It just wore out. So you did things like turning brake drums and boring cylinders and putting oversized rings on your pistons. It was part of owning a car. There were some people, it was new every two. I think they still even say that. But that was a thing back then, is every 2 years, trade in your car for a new one. And in some ways, as long as you could afford it, that wasn't a bad thing to do because a lot of things wore out after 2 years. A lot of things wore out after a couple of months, like oil changes every 2 or 3,000 miles, brake jobs every, what I would say, like every 10,000 miles, maybe less, depending on whether you're using your brakes a lot. Yeah, just a lot of stuff that you did on your cars all the time. That's why you got, backyard mechanic, right? You heard that phrase. Maybe you heard it, maybe you didn't. I don't know. But there was a phrase, backyard mechanic, because a lot of people, unless you were quite wealthy, where you had your own mechanic, you had a mechanic, just learned to do a lot of this maintenance, this fairly heavy duty maintenance on their own. And propping this up, there's a spot there that I filled in that I need to remember to sand down. Okay, so what did I get done today? You can see that I did practically nothing, right? There's a part that I made, I cleaned up. I got one of 3 of these brackets done. I cleaned up some parts on the lunar module, the lunar excursion module, the LEM. I attached some pieces that on Monday I will be sanding down seams and probably putting some filler in. And then sanding them because there's just unavoidable gaps. They're just there. And I'll be doing more of the same. I'm just going to be doing little bits of sanding, filing and sanding and filling for a while until these things are ready to put together. And then I'm going to get really brave and cut out the windows for the LEM and install them. and hopefully they will adhere really well so that I can tape them, and I can get the tape well into the little bitty corners so that I can prime this whole thing once I get all the gaps, well, so that I can put it together, clean up the seams and then prime and paint without the windows being covered with paint or popping out. Otherwise, this model isn't going to have windows, So that's going to be a really critical part of the modeling process, is getting that done. So thank you for watching. The stuff did get done, but you can hardly tell, and that's what I warned you about at the very beginning of this stream, that I'd probably be spending 3 plus hours, and it wouldn't look like I accomplished anything. And I think I succeeded in that promise, in getting 3.5 hours worth of work done and looking like I accomplished nothing. I was pretty good at doing that. I did a good job of that. And so on Monday, I will be doing more of what I was doing today, which is working on seams. I'll be doing some sanding here. I'll be filling in some gaps. I don't know, maybe I'll fill in some gaps and then do some sanding. It's just, these things just really annoy me if they don't fit together that well. Just keep plugging away at it. Eventually, there's nothing really more that's difficult. There's a lot that's tedious, except for the windows. I am concerned about that. So that aside, this should move. This, I'm not going to say is moving along quickly. It's not going to move along quickly. It's going to move along slowly. But we'll see very slow and steady progress in the assembly of the Ascent module. And if that gets too tedious, I'll paint some astronauts. Maybe I'll paint some astronauts, some detail on them, and maybe some of these antennae. I want to prime this one just to get it primed. These guys, I'm just going to paint white. They're primed now, so I'm going to be painting white on white on white. This will just be white on white, and then it'll be some sort of metallic colors. Yeah. So maybe I'll do some painting on Monday. What I'll probably do is do some gap filling and some sanding, on the parts that I attached today. I'll probably do that just a little bit. And maybe save working on these brackets. These are very badly shaped, malformed brackets Wednesday. So anyway, I can't promise, but that's what I'm kind of planning to do, is, kind of maybe do some work on the antennae, some hand painting on that, and mixing that in with the seam removal process. We'll see how that goes. I think I'm going to sand it down and then see whether the melted plastic from the cementing it together filled the gap or not. And where it didn't, I don't know, I'll just put some filler in. And like I said, it might look like a welding line, which would be okay, but it won't be a gap, which would not be okay. Yep, that's relaxing. A little bit of painting, tiny little bit of painting, but mostly talking about old car maintenance while I was doing what looked like no progress at all, but actually was quite a lot of work with Dice and Dungeons. Please, if you can, catch our Dungeons and Dragons show, either with the live chat on Sundays at 2, or catch it on YouTube. It's just as much fun. And you can catch up with old episodes that way. What else? Yep. I'll keep talking about dungeon tiles each time I come back on. That'll be kind of a recurring theme. Thank you for being a follower, new follower today. If you go on YouTube, you can become a sponsor. And you can always go to patreon.com/diceanddungeons. That's patreon.com/diceanddungeons. Become a patron. You can, if you become a patron, you can help me buy some new sandpaper, maybe, or another can of primer paint. Maybe you can become a really big patron. You can become you can show up at a certain level of being a patreon.com/diceanddungeons supporter of this show. You can be in the credits at the end of our D&D show, be named in the credits. And there are even other cool things that you can get that I am not going to tell you about now because it's time to end. Thanks so much. See you on Monday at more or less 10 as I continue to very slowly and tediously plug away at the Apollo model. Thanks.